Hi everyone, my name is Bella and my topic for my oral presentation is child neglect and substance abuse. There are multiple definitions for child neglect and they can vary state to state, which is why it's incredibly important that people be aware of what their state defines neglect as. A general definition for child neglect is a multidimensional construct that includes emotional, cognitive, supervisory, and physical domains. It is distinguished from abuse by focusing on a parent's failure to act in ways that meet a child's basic needs, resulting in the actual or potential harm to the child. As stated previously, it's important that people are aware and research what their state defines neglect as it can vary, and what one state considers neglect, the other state might not. It's also important to mention that neglect is still neglect whether it's intentional or not. A person who is in poverty that's trying to provide the best she can for her kids, where she's trying to feed them the best they can, if they're still malnourished and their basic needs aren't getting met, it's still neglect, regardless of whether she was intending to neglect them or not. I know a lot of people, when they first hear neglect, they automatically jump to parents who just don't care for their kids and almost think of it as a malicious act, where sometimes people do have the best intentions. Substance abuse is defined as any use of psychoactive substances such as steroids, alcohol, cannabis, stimulants, opioids, etc. There are a number of different types of neglect, and I know when people often hear neglect, they think of the physical neglect, such as like the lack of food, clothing, housing for kids. It's one of those where physical neglect kind of addresses a lot of what is on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where their basic needs really aren't getting met. In addition, there's medical neglect, where kids might not be brought for their doctor's appointments, so a lot of little kids have a lot of doctor's appointments needed. This also includes the dentist, where sometimes they're just not brought to them, and it also means that they aren't getting the necessary medical attention. So like when kids have very serious accidents, where like they could have a concussion, they could have broken bones, and they're just not brought, that can also be neglect. Inadequate supervision is another one, where either the person who is supervising them is doing it where the kids aren't exactly in a safe environment. They have access to a number of different hazards. So an example of this would be kids who have access to cleaning materials. So little kids who can go and like pick up like a bottle of like Windex or bleach or have stuff like that, and they can get into it and aren't being stopped and supervised by adults. Another one is also inappropriate caregivers, where sometimes the person supervising these kids, they're not adults. So this is one where it also depends on state laws about how old a child has to be in order to care for other kids. Some states say that younger ages are able to stay alone. Some of them are very specific, so it's also important for people to be aware of what their state says as far as that. But for this one, it's like when you have siblings taking care of other siblings. So if you have like an 11-year-old who's sitting there taking care of multiple younger siblings, really like an 11-year-old shouldn't be caring for multiple younger siblings, especially because they're pretty young themselves. Another one is environmental safety, so that's like allowing kids to explore an unsafe neighborhood. Educational, that it can be parents refusing to send their kids to school. It can also be parents who just aren't enforcing school with their kids. So it happens a lot. At least in my personal experience, it happens a lot with your middle school and high school kids, where they don't want to go to school, but unfortunately laws tell them that they have to. And so if their parents aren't enforcing and trying to get them to go to school, they can file for educational neglect, and that's a lot of times in my experience it's filed by schools, but a parent has to be actively trying to get their kids to go to school. There's emotional neglect, which can be parents who are isolating their kids for extended periods of time. So when people hear isolation, they think of like a timeout, but this would be like extended periods of time where they just don't have human contact. Another one is the lack of like emotional connection. So this is most common in babies, where it's most commonly known as like failure to thrive. And then an additional area is babies addicted or exposed to drugs. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. There are a couple of general statistics about child neglect. So there is a rise between the number of kids involved with investigations. So between the years of 2014 and 2018, this number rose 8.4%. So that's more specifically in regards to the children involved, not exactly the reports. So it's just saying that the number of kids involved with investigations rose 8%. So in addition to that rising, the number of cases investigated per child could also rise as well, and that was seen in a lot of the data as well. 84% of child victims suffered a single type of maltreatment, while 15% suffered at least two or more. So this would be 84% suffering a single type. So a single type would be just neglect, just sexual abuse, but 15% or more suffered at least two or more. Out of that 84%, 60.8 were neglected. And in 2018, 1,770 children died due to abuse and neglect. The most common perpetrator of the child maltreatment were the mother and father, either one or the other or both. And more often than not, women were the perpetrator. Parental substance abuse. So the number of cases involving parents with substance abuse is on the rise. 19.3% of children fatalities had parents with a risk factor of drug abuse, and 5.9% had a risk factor of alcohol abuse. The likelihood of abuse and neglect significantly increases due to impairments and working memory caused by substance abuse. So with this, it's more when people are under the influence, they're not always making the best decisions, and due to those impairments that kids can suffer. So it's one of those where if a parent is under the influence, they might not be supervising their child, they might not be making sure their basic needs are met. So it might be that they're not being fed, that like there are so many different options, and it's one of those where the substance abuse really impacts their ability to care for the children. And studies showed that there are likely presence of multiple substances being used, not just a single one. So while parents might be using drugs, it might also be that they're using alcohol as well. And there are a number of other risk factors with the parents that contribute to the likelihood of abuse and neglect. And so these risk factors are cognitive functioning and emotional regulation, impulsivity, and it really just plays a role in the lack of safety when adults are abusing substances, because it puts them at a higher likelihood of abusing and neglecting their children. Obviously, the use of parental substance abuse has an impact on the children. Children exposed to opiate use while their parent is pregnant often display behavior and attention difficulties. So this is where like a lot of kids have developed ADHD if they were exposed to substances while their mother was pregnant. Parental substance abuse often leads to children being placed in foster care, and it is the leading cause of children entering foster care system. Foster homes for children with behavior and attention difficulties can be extremely difficult to locate. So in my area, these foster homes are called intensive foster homes, where these foster parents have to go through an extensive amount of training, and it's a lot more training than a typical foster parent would. And often these intensive foster homes, they're limited to the amount of foster kids that they can have just due to the nature of the kids that they are taking in, because a lot of them do display those behavior and attention difficulties. And so trying to find foster homes for these kids are extremely difficult, and even normal foster homes are hard to find, never mind the homes designed for behavior and attention difficulties with kids. And then children who have parents that abuse substances are more likely to develop their own addiction problems as well. There are a number of risk factors for kids that puts them at a higher risk for being neglected. So the most common age of child maltreatment is actually kids under the age of 1. 45% of the children who died were under the age of 1. Nearly 2/3 who died were under the age of 3. So that 1 to 3 age range is extremely difficult for parents to deal with. So when they're using substances on top of that, it often leads to child death. While boys and girls are almost equally maltreated in the United States, boys have a higher mortality rate. Children of color are often overrepresented in the foster care system due to child maltreatment, more specifically poverty and the lack of resources. This is kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about how it's not always intentional that parents neglect their kids due to like the lack of resources in a lot of impoverished areas. It just leads to children being removed just due to those lack of resources and the parents not unwillingness to do it, but like inability to get to those resources. And then children with disabilities and behavior issues are at a higher risk of being abused and maltreated. The parental risk factors are previous trauma history, ADHD, ODD, and other prevalent mental illness, substance abuse, and poverty. The history of neglect, there really isn't a set type of history. It's one of those where in around like the 1960s is when child neglect started to get a lot of attention. They had started with reporting child abuse, and that kind of created a chain effect for creating the Child Protective Services, which came about in, I want to say, 1972. They came up with mandated reporting laws, which reported people, which essentially is people in certain professions, so social workers, teachers, pretty much anyone involved in human services are required to report any signs of abuse or neglect. If you want, you can pause the video just to kind of like read through the chart. I know also a huge improvement was the incorporation of virtual gateways for the Child Protective Services. So in my job, we have access to this gateway, and it kind of just allows us to kind of see the different services that have been put in place and kind of just see like where the kid has been through and like what has been used. And it's been helpful in being able to track kids throughout like different states and whatnot. So it's made a lot of that work a lot easier. But feel free to pause and go through that entire chart. There are a number of services that people can utilize when child neglect is suspected. So the most prevalent one is Child Protective Services. As stated previously, there are mandated reporters. So all of us are mandated reporters. So if we suspect it, we do have to file a report with Child Protective Services. Oftentimes when Child Protective Services gets involved, they have to do the investigation, and then through that investigation, they can either put in home services, they can